Welcome everyone. First and foremost, I would like to give a huge shout out and thank you to Andrea Catalani for sharing his extra iRacing account with me. Without his kind generosity, this video wouldn't have been possible. Now my goal when making this video was to find a way of maximizing the force feedback signal in iRacing, whilst increasing compatibility with Forza EmuWheel for users who play both games. From what I've seen, the most common method people are using involves the use of IRFFB 1.4.2 and vJoy 2.1.8. This is where I encountered issues during testing which forced me to troubleshoot. First, IRFFB 1.4.2 utilizes an outdated version of vJoy and eliminates the option of using newer vJoy plugins. If you use Forza EmuWheel, you'll find using this version of IRFFB limits you to the 360Hz modes and prohibits the use of the 60Hz direct modes. Second, vJoy 2.1.8 I found can be unstable with newer versions of Windows and is incompatible with Forza EmuWheel, which eliminates our option to play some Forza games. Through lots of researching and testing, I found two options to maximize the signal coming from iRacing, improve stability with newer Windows builds, and increase compatibility with other games that use vJoy. Option A, we download and use IRFFB without installing vJoy, which will allow you to use the 360Hz modes. This is the simplest method as it doesn't require the use of vJoy but introduces the most latency and prohibits the use of 60Hz direct modes. Choose this option if you are already using vJoy 2.1.9.1 for Forza EmuWheel, or if you're only interested in using the 360Hz modes. This option is also good for those who are unsure about IRFFB and would like to see what it offers before diving deeper. Option B, we download a newer version of vJoy along with an updated IRFFB app. This method allows the use of 60Hz direct modes, which minimizes latency but requires the installation and use of vJoy. This option is recommended for users running vJoy 2.1.8 or earlier, or users who don't have vJoy installed and intend on using the 60Hz direct modes in IRFFB. As always, download links for everything I mentioned in this video will be in the description below, and with that said, let's move on to the first section. The first thing that we're going to need is the IRFFB app. I found two versions that are compatible with later revisions of vJoy. I've also included a link to the IRFFB wiki down below if you wish to read up on how this app works prior to trying these methods. The first one is IRFFB 1.5.9, which can be found by clicking the link below. This is the most recent version, which has added understeer support for various cars and seems to have increased stability over version 1.4.2. Now this version, when downloading it, may flag a false positive in your antivirus software due to it being an uncommon download. From looking through the source code and scanning the exe file, I was unable to find anything pertaining to a virus. If this makes you uncomfortable or you feel I'm incorrect, don't worry, I have an alternate version for you. For those of you who would like to try this version, we're going to click on the exe file and save it to our PC. I'm going to save it to my desktop here. And if it does throw a flag like this, just click the three dots here, click on keep. As you can see, it's not commonly downloaded, which is a generic error. So if you'd like to use it, click on show more and then keep anyway. Now for the people who are wary about trying this version, you can click on the alternate link below, which will bring us to this page here. This one is a fork of the 2018 version, but bypasses the version check of vJoy, allowing us to use later revisions of vJoy like the one required for Forza EmuWheel. Simply click on the zip file and save it to your PC. Once complete, you'll have to extract the contents to a folder. This will leave you with an exe file along with two DLL files that are required in order to run correctly. I suggest placing that folder somewhere you won't forget to launch it prior to iRacing. If you decided on option A, you can proceed to the next section. If you chose option B, we need to download vJoy 2.1.9.1 by clicking the link below and then clicking on this vJoy setup.exe file. If you're a Forza Emu Wheel user, this part should already be done since this is the same version of vJoy. If you're using a version of vJoy that is below this, you'll need to uninstall it prior to installing this version. Once uninstalled, reboot your PC and meet me back here. Now before you install vJoy, it's advised to unplug all of your USB controllers to prevent the installation from hanging. Once the installation completes, you can plug your gear back into your PC and continue to configure vJoy. In order to do that, you need to click on your Start menu here, scroll down to your vJoy folder, and then click on Configure vJoy. Now, if you only plan on playing iRacing and don't require vJoy for other games like Forza, then you can uncheck everything on the left here except for the X-axis. Buttons at 0 since we're only using vJoy for the steering axis. POV hat switch will set to continuous and POVs at 0. Force feedback, everything should be check marked. You're going to then click apply and then reboot your PC. If you use or plan on using Forza Emu Wheel, we need to check mark everything on the left here under axis. We need to set our buttons to the maximum, which is 128. POV hat switch needs to be on 4 directions and POVs on 1. Everything on the right here needs to be check marked. After that, click apply, reboot your PC, then meet me in the next section. In Race Manager, we are going to start off by setting the total force to your preferred strength. Consider this your volume dial. If you want a stronger wheel, increase this value. If you prefer a weaker wheel, lower this value. I recommend starting at 80 and going from there. Wheel speed, I recommend starting at 100. This setting determines how fast your wheel can react to the force feedback effects coming from the game. If you find that your wheel is too wild or snappy, you can reduce this value at the cost of detail and fidelity, as anything less than 100 starts to introduce a damping effect. Lowering this value too much will lead to a heavy and sluggish wheel with little to no detail. Wheel damper adds a smooth friction effect to your wheel. This is a constant effect that is always applied even when the game isn't running. The main purpose of this setting is to help remove the spring-like feeling in your wheel and make it feel more like it's connected to the steering rack of a car. This setting can also be used to add some weight to your wheel or help smooth out sharp forces. The higher you set this, the more detail you will lose. Filter frequency is a personal choice. The lower this value is, the smoother the force feedback will be at the cost of fidelity and detail. Higher values are closer to the game output and provide sharper, more direct force feedback. Wheel spring, I recommend leaving this at 0 as it's another constant effect that impedes self-aligning torque and cornering forces. This effect always forces your wheel back to center like rubber bands are attached to your wheel. Most games have a dynamic centering force, making this setting redundant. However, if you feel the need to use this effect, it's best to keep this as low as possible. Wheel friction is a constant force similar to wheel damper, only it uses a sticky friction instead. This setting is best suited for removing oscillations because of its sticky nature. It decelerates the momentum in your wheel far quicker than wheel damper does, which helps prevent momentum buildup and creates a calmer wheel during straights. Keep this as low as possible to minimize the loss of detail. All game effects and game forces should be kept at 100 so we don't restrict or boost the force feedback signal coming from the game. We don't want any hardware clipping and we don't want a restricted signal. There should be no need to touch these settings unless the game is lacking in adjustments. Between IRFFB and the mechanical settings in Race Manager, you should be able to find a good setting for your car. Steering angle should be set to 900 degrees. iRacing soft lock feature works, so we don't have to worry about adjusting our rotation every time we change cars. Suspension, I prefer to leave on normal as no extra effects are applied to this setting. You may prefer soft or hard. I suggest trying all three and see what suits you best. Response I have on stable as it's closer to the game output and seems to give better fidelity. Wild may be more preferable for you as it boosts some effects. Try both and see what you prefer. Now that we have Race Manager set up, we can move on to the next section. If you're currently using an older version of IRFFB than the one I'm recommending in this video, you'll have to delete a couple files in order to prevent some issues from occurring. We're going to click on File Explorer at the bottom here, and we can click on My Documents. Another way to get here is to click on your C drive, Users, your username, OneDrive, and then Documents. If you scroll to the bottom here, we're looking for this IRFFB.ini file or any file. We want to click on that and press delete. After that is done, we want to navigate to your iRacing folder, open that up, and we want to find this vJoy calibration.yaml file. We want to delete that as well. Once you've done that, we can close out of here. We can now launch IRFFB and proceed to set it up. If you find that the app doesn't launch when double clicking on it, there are two things that you can do. First, check your taskbar to make sure the app hasn't started in a minimized state. If it has, left click on the icon and uncheck the Start Minimized box. Second, if the app refuses to launch and it isn't minimized in your taskbar, press Ctrl plus Shift plus Escape on your keyboard to bring up your task manager. Scroll down to IRFFB, click on it, then click on End Task. Move IRFFB to another location and relaunch it. You should find that it launches now and can proceed to move IRFFB back to its original location. Now that IRFFB is running, we will start with FFB device, which should say Simagic. If you chose option A, you're limited to the 360 Hz modes. I recommend trying both to see what suits you best. If you chose option B, you have 4 modes to choose from. The 360 Hz modes provide maximum force feedback by reading data from the telemetry, but introduce the most latency. The 60 Hz direct modes provide the least amount of latency and clean up the vanilla force feedback signal to produce smoother and more detailed results. Personally, I find the 60 Hz direct mode gives me a better connection with the car and allows me to push harder with more confidence. I also find with 60 Hz direct mode that I can run less filter in Race Manager, allowing me to bring more detail out in the game. I recommend trying all 4 to see what you prefer and what suits you best. Minimum force, I recommend leaving at 0 for direct drive wheels. Anything higher than 0 starts to create a notch in the wheel when passing center. Max force will be adjusted on a per car basis. Higher numbers provide weaker force feedback, lower numbers provide stronger force feedback. How I understand it is the number you set here is the max force your car has to reach in game in order to output 100% force to your wheel. For example, setting this to 40 means your car needs to reach 40 Newton meters in its steering rack in game in order to produce 100% force feedback through your wheel. For now, we will set this to 40. Damping, how much you set here is up to you. This is a constant force which is always enabled. Running low amounts of damping, like 5 to 10%, can help provide a more natural feel, but reduces detail the more you use. Experiment to find your perfect setting. Suspension bumps. This sets the magnitude of extra bumps and textures generated from the front suspension telemetry. Raise this slider up to increase the effects from road surfaces and curb strikes. Don't raise this too high or the force feedback will feel too sharp and unnatural. Now, personally, I've found that when using the 60 Hz direct modes, I am able to use higher amounts of suspension bumps before it starts to feel unnatural. Understeer. This reduces torque when understeering and is only implemented for some cars. For cars that are not supported, this slider will be grayed out. The higher you raise the slider, the weaker your wheel becomes when understeering. Lower values provide more linear results. I suggest starting at 35 and see how that feels for you. Understeer offset is recommended to stay at 0. This sets the minimum slip angle at which the understeer effect kicks in. SOP or seat of pants is the most game-changing effect here. This helps point your tires in the right direction when losing control and gives much more fidelity to your car. It's almost like having aim assist in an FPS game, which makes driving on the limit much more controllable. I find it feels quite nice at 50, but you may prefer a different value depending on your car and driving style. SOP offset should be kept at 0. This sets the minimum slip angle at which the seat of pants effect kicks in. Use 360 Hz telemetry for suspension effects in direct modes. Only applies to the 60 Hz direct modes. If this is checked, the 360 Hz suspension telemetry is used. This allows you to mix in some of the higher frequency detail that's absent from the 60 Hz output. This will bring your latency up to roughly 15 milliseconds. If this is unchecked, the 60 Hz suspension telemetry is used and output is passed through the same FIR filter as the standard force feedback signal. High frequency details will be absent, but the latency of the effects are reduced to only 4 milliseconds. Try both and see what you prefer. Use car specific settings should be checked so we can maximize every car that we plan on driving. This allows us to use different force feedback modes and settings with different cars. If you play other games other than iRacing, I recommend unchecking Run on Startup, as IRFFB tends to cause issues like no force feedback in certain games. Only use this option if you play iRacing exclusively. Start minimized I leave unchecked, as well as debug logging. IRFFB is now set up and ready to go. For those of you who don't use Forza EMU Wheel, you can launch iRacing and proceed to the next section. This is a tip for anyone using Forza EMU Wheel. Due to how we have to configure vJoy in order to use EMU Wheel, you may encounter unregistered inputs when using IRFFB. The later versions of IRFFB do work, but they seem to have the most conflicts with our vJoy configuration. The alternate version worked better for me, but still causes an unregistered input with the hat switch. This doesn't seem to affect gameplay, but does affect my start menu. So, when you're done racing, exit IRFFB, launch Forza EMU Wheel, click Start, and then Stop. This will reset vJoy back to its default state. With that out of the way, we can move on to the next section. We are now in game with IRFFB running in the background. Before driving, we need to calibrate our steering axis or we won't have force feedback. The following steps need to be completed once for every car that we use. Start by heading to Options and click on Use Custom Controls for this car. Once enabled, click on Steering and proceed to calibrate your wheel. Your steering axis should read 0 when your wheel is completely rotated to the left. Turning your wheel to the far right should read 65,535 or 200%. Centering your wheel should read 100%. If you experience issues during calibration, click on the reset button and try again. Once calibrated, click Done, then rotate your wheel to the left until the value reads 900. Click Done, then Done. You'll notice that the force feedback controls are grayed out. This is because everything is now controlled through the IRFFB app. Enable force feedback must be checkmarked if you're using the 60 Hz direct modes. This setting doesn't make a difference if you're only using the 360 Hz modes. We can now click Done and get into our car. Now, anytime you want to make changes in IRFFB, you can simply press Alt plus Tab on your keyboard to bring up the app. Start by heading onto the track and driving a lap to warm up your tires. After your warm-up lap, you'll want to start pushing your car. You want to drive aggressively so that IRFFB provides accurate clipping values, but not to the point where you're losing control of the car. Crashing and going off track will be factored into IRFFB's calculations, giving us inaccurate results. Once you've completed 2 or 3 clean laps, stop your car and go back to the pits. Exiting your car will end the session, which in turn updates IRFFB and provides us with a clipping value. Alt-tab over to IRFFB and adjust the max force slider up or down based on your clipping value. It is best to keep clipping as low as possible. I suggest aiming for less than 1% clipping. However, with some cars it may be beneficial to allow a bit more clipping. Try not to go over 5% or you start to lose too much information at the top end of the force feedback spectrum. Make adjustments and retest until you have maximized your car with minimal clipping. Exiting iRacing will make IRFFB save your configuration for your current car. Once you have a configuration saved, IRFFB will automatically load those settings anytime you use that particular car. That brings us to the end of this video. Click the like button if any of this helped you out, and with that, I will catch you in my next video. Peace.